Diana is, she's got the meeting recorded and gotten started. So I honestly think, Diana, that
now
you're ready.
Jill and LaDonna.
We can, I think now, if you're ready, we can go ahead and get started. And keep in mind, everyone, that if you please can mute your phone, it's appreciated. Otherwise, Diana, if we have too much background noise, Diana will mute everyone, and then we'll worry about it from there. But Diana, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself, if that's okay.
Great, I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Go ahead and get, there we go. So just our agenda today is I'll go ahead and introduce our company, RLR, and myself. We'll go through, I think one of the things that Kate really wanted me to talk about today is suspicious activity reporting. So we'll go through some general things about suspicious activity reporting, and then wanted to provide you some information regarding voluntary sharing, 314B of the USA Patriot Act. This is just a really hot topic right now, marijuana-related businesses. I'll go through some resources for you, and hopefully we'll have time for questions and an open discussion after that. RLR has been in business for over 30 years now. They started
now joining.
Julie.
They started out primarily in the technology industry and with doing RFPs, and core conversion support, and have just blossomed into regulatory compliance, audits, operational efficiencies, merger and acquisitions. They have serviced over 1,000 clients nationwide. And I know that RLR, Ruth Razzouk, the founder of RLR, is very well respected in the industry and has quite a bit of expertise and talks with the different regulators all the time. So, and then I've been with RLR for about 11 years. My background has been in banking for my life. I have on here over 30 years because it's actually over 40, but when I say that, it makes me sound really old. So I started out in a major bank and have experience in several different size financial institutions. And I became CAM certified, I think about 5-6 years ago, and I've been conducting BSA audits for community banks and credit unions of various sizes for over 10 years now. It's actually, when I tell people I love BSA, they kind of laugh at me, but I really do like it. There's such diverse information, and anyway, I could go on and on about that. But so we'll go ahead and get started on talking about suspicious activity reporting. And really the first part of the reporting is gathering the facts. And you really need to know the customer's normal and expected activity. So that's obviously the due diligence information that's collected at the account opening and periodically if it changes, because you can't look at different trends or spikes in the activity unless you have a baseline to go from. And so with that baseline of activity, obviously, you can, take a look at that and say, okay, this is what the customer told us they were going to do, and now we're seeing something different. And just remember too, when you're looking at facts regarding suspicious activity reporting, remember the definition of suspicious activity. And that's part of that is transactions conducted or attempted to be conducted, as long as they meet that minimum dollar threshold for suspicious activity reporting. So if you have attempted wire fraud or you have check fraud, remember that those types of, or elder abuse, financial elder abuse, those types of things require suspicious activity reporting. So you need to gather, those facts as well and make sure that you're reporting anything that's criminal, whether it actually happened or it was attempted, to be sure that you're reporting all the required information. And so when you take a look at your baseline activity and you see something going on that's different than what the customer had expected or what you're expecting in the account, don't be afraid to go ask your customer about that information, because that's where you're going to possibly get either an acknowledgement that what you think is suspicious is, or they can tell you, hey, you know what, I opened up a second store and we're doing really well. That's why my activity has increased. And that may say, okay, that's logical, so it's not really considered suspicious now. But don't ever be afraid to ask your customer, you know, if there's different activity that they're having other than what you thought, what they thought or you thought they were going to have on the account. And then do internet searches as well, because you may find, especially for businesses, there's information out there on the internet, and you may find something that tells you, hey, you know what, this is suspicious more than I thought. Of course, obviously you can't, everything on the internet is not true. So, I mean, you can't base all your decisions on what you find out there, but there just may be something out there that might help you in determining whether information is suspicious or not. Oops. Sorry. And then when identifying suspicious activity, one of the things
now joining
Pam,
that I always take a look at, in fact, I have a paper copy of it that is very dog-eared and has all kinds of little post-its on it, is the FFIEC BSA examination manual. The latest revision was in 2014. And there is so much good information in this book. And actually, you don't have to have it printed out. If you go to the FFIEC website, it is on there in an electronic format. But I would encourage all of you to take a look at these sections that I'm talking about. The suspicious activity reporting, the overview section, the money laundering and terrorist financing red flags. That's an excellent section or appendix that you can use as training for everyone in the bank. There's all different kinds of scenarios that there might be suspicious activity for. But I would encourage you to use that in your training sessions. There's an appendix that talks about different ways of structuring, one on customer risk versus due diligence, because you obviously don't have to have, you know, as much due diligence for a low risk person versus someone that has higher risk or a higher risk geography or a higher risk type of business. The Appendix L,
now joining,
is an excellent section. Sorry, I couldn't think of what I was going to say. There's an excellent section that talks about the narrative, what to put in the narrative, how to write the narrative. And so that one I think is really a good training tool for anyone that is going to be writing suspicious activity reports. Appendix S is key suspicious activity monitoring components. It just talks about if you have an automated system running the alerts and actually working the alerts. And then this one, although it's not in the BSA examination manual, it's FinCEN's guidance on human trafficking red flags. And that again is another one that should be used in your training so that someone can actually take a look at that. And this topic, human trafficking, is a topic that has just become really, really active recently. So I would definitely take a look at that and make sure that you're using that in your program. And then talking about suspicious activity reporting, there's manual gathering of facts versus an automated system. And when you're doing that manually, obviously you guys know if you don't have an automated system, it's very time consuming to be reviewing all of the reports that you're reviewing. And then are you sure that all the activity was reviewed? You know, did you review, or wire transfers reviewed, monetary instruments, all those different types of things. And with all that activity being reviewed, is it all put together to show a big picture of the customer versus just the individual types of transactions? And can you actually capture trends and spikes? I mean, So for instance, if they were depositing 10,000 last month and 5 months from now they're depositing, 20 or 30,000, which, is double what they were doing before, did you remember that 6 months ago or 5 months ago they were only depositing 10,000? So that one I think is a little bit harder to review, especially if you have a new BSA person, new analyst that's looking at this, or you're keeping track of it somehow. With an automated system, it obviously saves some time. Once you get the process in place, they work with most core solutions, and there's actually several of them out there that are very good. And it's interesting because I've done BSA audits and model validations on probably quite a few of the automated systems that are out there. And although each one has their own quirks, they're all actually very good at capturing the different activities that need to be captured. And I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. And Kate, if you want to just unmute yourself so that you can talk, that would be great. Perfect. So anyway, and with an automated system, you can actually customize your rules for your financial institution. All of them, with the exception of one of them, actually works on a rules and behavior basis, so you can customize those rules for your risk profile and for the particular customers that you have. And rules can be created for any type of activity as long as that activity is being flowed through the automated system. So especially if your institution is growing or you have a bigger risk profile for BSA, I would encourage you to take a look at some of the automated systems that are out there. Completing the report, and I'm sure most of you know this information, the reports must meet the minimum dollar requirements. The requirements are there just so that the law enforcement is not getting all these reports for really small dollar amounts. And then ensure that all the critical fields are completed. And if you're doing it electronically, I don't believe it will allow you to move forward unless those critical fields are completed. And then make sure you're completing all readily available information. So the institutions are not required to go out and find information that you don't have on a business. But if you have that information at the bank, then you should be putting it in the suspicious activity report. One of the ones that gets overlooked sometimes is the business identification. And you may not have that automated in your system, but if you have that information at the bank, it needs to be put into the suspicious activity report as well as the CTR. Make sure that your narrative includes the 5 W's, and these are the ones that are outlined in Appendix L, the SAR quality guidance, the who, what, why, where, and when. And then the other thing that they're also indicating that should be there is how, the method of operation. How did this activity occur? And then all of that should be included in the narrative. And then part of what the when did the suspicious activity take place? In order to better track of the flow of funds, individual dates and amounts of the transactions should be included in the narrative rather than only the aggregated amount. So with that, the law enforcement will be able to tell, okay, where were these funds? How did they get here? Instead of saying, okay, this person over a period of time brought in $100,000 in cash, they're going to want to know specifics about when that was brought in. And so I went to this next slide because if you can't, or the activity is too much that you don't want to include it in the narrative, you can attach supplemental information. They'd prefer it be a single Excel file. It doesn't matter how much information is in that Excel file, but that may give you a way of indicating dates and dollar amounts of transactions in an easier fashion than writing it up somehow in the narrative. And if you do attach supplemental information, you just need to document in the narrative that you attached a file with all of the transactions and dates in the Excel file. So this, I think, as I mentioned, the Appendix L for the SAR quality guidance is definitely something that I refer to, and I also refer to it and read through it periodically because it's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And so for someone that actually is reviewing your report as well, make sure that they have this information available or have read that information. So on completing the report, there's a couple of publications that I would refer you to so that it gives you additional information on how to fill in some of these boxes and what information should be there. And the first one is going to be, this is on FinCEN's website, the Suspicious Activity Report Electronic Filing Requirements. And it's dated 2012, but it has some really good information still. And I know that they just updated the SAR last year, but this really kind of gives you some additional information. And then the frequently asked questions. This is an older document as well, but it has some really good information and gives you a few examples of when something happens, this is how it needs to be reported. So I would really suggest that you look at those two documents. And then provide any information in the suspicious activity report, in the narrative, that may be helpful to law enforcement to understand what the situation is, why you feel it's suspicious activity, and so that they can take a look at that. So one of the things, the other thing that I think is critical is having a second review of the suspicious activity report before it is actually filed. And this is where the person that is reviewing it needs to look at this from the outside, because I know sometimes when you're involved in the activity and you're right in the middle of it, when you're writing a narrative, you know what's going on and you understand things that you may forget to put in the narrative. And so when I go out and do audits, I don't have any idea what happened. So when I read the narrative, it needs to have all of the information about what happened, you know, and chronologically, so that I understand as an auditor what that, what the activity happened, what the transactions, why you felt it was suspicious and what's going on. And the same thing with law enforcement. If they can't understand the information you're putting in the suspicious activity report, or the information kind of bounces from one thing to the next, it's not going to be helpful for them. And really, that's what your suspicious activity report is doing, is really trying to be helpful to law enforcement so they can go after these criminals and see what they're doing and make sure that they understand that. So make sure there's a second review process and that person kind of steps back, looks at all the information on there, make sure all the boxes are checked that need to be checked. And so that way you can hopefully miss some of the common errors that we see. And so these common errors are ones that I see out there when I'm doing a BSA audit. One of them is not completing all readily available information, such as the business identification. So again, that term is readily available. It doesn't mean you have to go out somewhere and find the information if you don't have it. The other one is, one of the other ones is submitting the victim as a subject of the SAR. So if you have a customer who's been a victim of wire fraud or suspected wire fraud, you're not going to list that customer as a subject in the SAR with all of his or her information. You'll want to put that information in the narrative, but that's a victim. It's not the person that's creating that suspicious activity. And the same thing for like elder abuse cases. You don't want to put the name of the elder who was victimized as a subject of the SAR. Documenting that information in the narrative is sufficient. The other item I see, documenting incorrect dollars on a continuing SAR or discrepancies between the dollar field and the narrative. So again, when I'm looking at a SAR during an audit, I take a look at the previous SAR that was done if it's a continuing SAR, and take a look at the dollar amount, and then look at the dollar amount of the current one and add those together, and that should add up to the dollar amount that states on the SAR that it's a continuing dollar amount. And I do see a lot of them that are not like that. So make sure that those dollars are correct. And then also make sure that the dollars that you list in the narrative as being suspicious matches the dollar field that you put on the SAR. And there's times where I see, you know, the dollar field on the SAR being, say, 20,000, but when I go start reading the narrative, they're talking about, you know, $10,000 here was suspicious. You know, there was another, you know, 25,000 over here. So just make sure, again, that the narrative matches the information that is in the actual SAR fields. Another one is not checking all the suspicious activity types. So read your narrative. One of the ones that seems to get missed the most from my experience is the transactions out of pattern for the customer is sometimes not checked, but yet when you read the narrative, it says that, you know, this customer is structuring and it's out of pattern for the customer, but only structuring was checked on the suspicious activity report in that section that talks about what activity do you find suspicious. So make sure when that person, the second review person, is reading through that they read the narrative and go back and see what suspicious activity types have been checked on that SAR. And then the same basic thing with the products that are involved. Again, just read the narrative because it may be that a customer brought in a cashier's check and cashed it for, you know, $10,000 in cash. So you're putting, you know, the product that was involved was cash, but you're forgetting that it was a bank check involved as well, or a business or a personal check. So make sure that you look at all of those, whether it's activity types or products, and make sure that all of those products are checked. And there's another section in there that talks about, and then they changed this with the new SAR. The last SAR that they had out, there was not a spot for you to check deposit account or checking account or bank account when they changed it. And so you were supposed to click Z, check Z, and put deposit account under other. With the new report that just came out, they have that a box that you can actually check again. So that was nice that they came out with that. Let's see. And I think I'll go ahead at this point and unmute everyone, just in case you have any questions regarding suspicious activity reporting at this time.
And Diana, just
so you know, it's Kate. I cannot see the chat box. So if there are questions in the chat box, I can't see it.
Okay, let me open the chat box.
Unless they sent it just to you, I see none for everyone, so.
That's what I see as well.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Now I'll be quiet in case anybody else actually has a question.
Okay, sounds good. So I will go ahead and move everybody back. So you're going to have to unmute yourself, Kate, if you for when you want to talk. Let me close that. So I'll move on to the voluntary information sharing section. And this is something that I know that when this first came out, that it was available to banks and financial institutions. I think everyone was kind of scared of using it because they were afraid of what they were going to be telling or talking to other banks about. But I know law enforcement encourages it, but I really encourage you, and it's only for financial institutions in the U.S., to share information, to identify and report suspicious activities. And it does provide a safe harbor of sharing within the guidelines. So the guidelines are out there. They're also in the FFIEC examination manual to provide that information. And it really, if there's multiple institutions involved, it just proves very useful in understanding what the suspicious activity is and how it's moving forward into other banks, or if it's, everything's being transferred within, 2 or 3 different banks. It's easy to register for it. You have to register annually, and it also has you designate a point of contact so that when someone is contacting the bank, they're contacting a specific person, and that so that hopefully, well, not hopefully, but you will have trained that person to make sure that they understand what information they can and can't share. And you only have access, you have access to ensure that other institutions that you're talking to are registered, because you can only share with 314B registered institutions. And then obviously you have to develop policies and procedures if you are going to voluntarily share information. And it may not be something that you're going to use, every day. You may not even use it in a year, but it's so helpful for that time when you actually just, you see something and you're seeing checks that are being drawn on another bank and you're wondering what's going on. But if you're not registered, then you wouldn't be able to call and ask the questions to kind of have a better understanding of what that, if that activity is suspicious or not. So, and you can register. I think it's on the FinCEN website, but this is something too that when your auditor comes out and reviews your BSA program, this is something that they would ask for a copy of your registration if you were voluntarily sharing information. I'll move on to marijuana-related businesses. And like I put on here, this is seriously a hot topic right now. It's just really crazy how this has just all of a sudden popped up. And I think part of it is because more and more states are actually legalizing recreational marijuana. So I just put in a couple of facts here. Medical marijuana is legal in 33 states. And I know that for medical marijuana, the Department of Justice has made it so that they can't use any funds to prosecute or do anything for the states that have legalized medical marijuana. But for recreational marijuana, there's nothing like that out there right now. It's legal in 10 states and the District of Columbia. And just from information that I've been reading, there's more states that are soon to follow legalizing recreational marijuana. But it's still considered an illegal substance at the federal level. And I think that's the critical key here is that anything that has to do with any type of marijuana is still considered illegal at the federal level, which means any activity associated with that should be reported as suspicious activity because it's criminal. But there is legislation currently being discussed to revise the federal stance. And I think that it was just introduced in March, this month. It's called the Safe Banking Act. And basically, it would allow banks to serve the MRBs without fear of penalties from any of the bank regulatory agencies. It would also protect ancillary businesses that work with the MRBs. And then the federal agencies would be required to develop guidance to help the financial institutions understand how to bank MRBs. So we'll see how that actually plays out. I think it's one of those things that it's not if there will be legislation to allow that, or I think it's more when. And actually in discussions, it seems like that is something that may happen, and I kind of feel that it might happen either this year or possibly next year, but it's not going to be that much longer before there is some relief to actually bank these types of businesses. And this is whether or not you think you want to or bank MRB customers, you have to conduct a risk assessment to determine what level of MRB customer you're going to consider or not. So you can put in your policy that no, we're not banking marijuana related businesses, but you need to do a risk assessment. It doesn't have to be this huge, undertaking. It can actually just be part of your regular BSA risk assessment. But there's different tiers, different levels of marijuana related businesses. So for example, the cities, the counties, and the states who take licensing fees and taxes, they're basically taking funds that were derived from illegal activity. So they would pretty much be considered a marijuana related business. Now they're not, they're not a dispensary, or they're not touching the plants, but they are taking funds that were derived from that supposedly illegal activity. So some of you may have those types of MRB customers that are indirectly related to an MRB, but you have to define what customers you may or may not accept, and then your policy has to document those decisions. And typically, what I've been seeing out there in the industry, although there's no guidance, and you know what, I forgot to document the guidance that came out regarding MRBs. I should have done that. And maybe, Kate, I'll send you a link to the document that talks about what must be, what you have to do if you do decide to bank MRBs that actually touch the money, or dispensaries or growers and that sort of thing. But there's typically tiers. The guidance doesn't tell you that you need to create a tier level for MRBs, but it's one of those things that that we're starting to see out there in the industry, is that, for instance, a tier 1 MRB is a customer that actually touches everything about marijuana. It touches the plant, so it's sales, dispensaries, growers, distributors, any of those types of MRBs. And then there's the tier 2 that may or may not do anything with a plant. And then tier 3s are very indirectly. So a tier 3 might be a landlord that has a dispensary in his building. But still, that landlord would be considered an MRB. So I'm hopeful that when the legislation comes out, that there's some type of a distinguishing feature that will make it easier for banks to kind of determine, okay, do I have to file a suspicious activity report on this person just because he's has a dispensary that is in his tenant in his strip mall. So hopefully that will happen soon. But your policies and procedures need to document how to identify a potential MRB. What are you doing to determine if one of your customers is an MRB? Are you looking at the activity, the cash activity? Are you looking at, who the person is related to, and looking on the internet to see what this business does? And especially because it's really interesting when these MRBs want to be banked. Some of them are very creative on their business name, not thinking that, okay, well, this doesn't say anything about marijuana, so I'm going to be good to go and I can, disguise my activity. But then you go onto the internet and see that name and think, wait a minute, that might be even suspicious. It's like, what is this person really doing? So, but I see interesting names all the time for marijuana related businesses. But anyway, your policies and procedures have to document how to identify that. What are you going to do as an institution to determine if all of a sudden you have a customer that didn't say they were doing anything with marijuana, but you find out that they do, and then what you do if you identify that person. So if your policy says we're not going to bank any marijuana related businesses because we just don't have the expertise and the knowledge and the resources we need to monitor the activity, you need to determine what you're going to do and how if you identify that, and for instance, just exit the customer. But your policies and procedures need to document that, whether or not you are banking MRB clients. So, and the other thing that the state of California just recently legalized recreational marijuana, and RLR actually assisted the state of California because they understand that there's a need out there to bank these businesses. It's really kind of considered dangerous because they don't have anywhere to take their cash, because most businesses aren't going to bank a marijuana-related business yet because they really don't know what they need to do that, and they don't want to get, slapped at the federal level. So anyway, the state of California wanted a feasibility study to determine, if it was feasible for the state of California to create a public bank that could bank money-related marijuana-related businesses. So RLR helped in that study, and that study was posted, I think in December. They finished up that, and really it came down to that it really wasn't feasible for the state to have a public bank to do this. And so we're kind of back to hoping that legislation comes through to make sure that this happens. But what we've done at RLR is we've actually added an MRB work program to our BSA audits, so that we can kind of capture and make sure that that all of the BSA programs out there are actually have information regarding marijuana-related businesses. And again, right now, even if it's not legal in your state, once this legislation comes through, it probably will be. So you will need to be documenting some of this information in a risk assessment in your policy, just so that the bank and the board of directors understand this is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, especially if you're not going to bank marijuana-related businesses. If you do make a decision to bank marijuana-related businesses, there is so much information that needs to be gathered and needs to be identified. And that's another one of the reasons that we added that to our work program, because of the guidance that came out that said these are the different things that you need to do, which part of that includes determining if you're the person that you're banking, what is the dollar amount their peers are taking in, and is it feasible that this person would be taking in this amount if their peers are taking in this amount. So it's just a lot of information that you need. And the guidance that came out basically states everything that you would need to do to monitor those marijuana-related businesses if you decide to do that. And then I have just some resources, and this isn't all of the resources, but one of the best ones that I use, like I said, all the time is the FFIEC BSA AML examination manual. And that has a lot of information in that manual. And then fincin.gov. And one of the things I would suggest, if you haven't already done so, is subscribe to their newsletter. And because then you'll get emails in your inbox that talk about enforcement actions that may have happened, anytime FinCEN changes any information. And it isn't very often that they send stuff, so it's not like it's going to be inundating your inbox. But the regulatory examiner sites, FDIC, NCUA, OCC, etc., those also have enforcement actions. It has more enforcement actions than just BSA, but it does have BSA and OFAC on there. And I would highly encourage you to review the enforcement actions and share those with your board of directors so that they kind of understand what's happening out there in the industry as well. And then obviously your BSA auditor would be a good resource to ask questions to. And then the other one is bankersonline.com. And the reason I suggest to subscribe to their daily email, I mean, they have all kinds of advertisements and stuff on it too, but when an enforcement action happens, the next day they highlight that in their Bankers Online daily email. And they also have other items in there that might be of interest to you as well, but it's specifically from a BSA standpoint. If there's something that you missed or something that you didn't get from FinCEN or your examiner, typically it'll show up in there, and you can make sure that you grab it from there. I think that is the end of my presentation. So I don't know if anyone has any questions about any of those subjects or any subjects at all regarding BSA. Let's see if there, it doesn't look like there were any questions in chat either.
Okay. So, anybody have any questions? Anything that you want to ask somebody who has done a lot of work? You don't have to tell us who you are, and we, you know, she's not going to come back and audit you later, but. I have a couple questions. First one is in regards to the 314B. Have you seen financial institutions that aren't sharing all of a sudden start sharing because they had a problem, and you know, there's they wish they had asked, or they haven't registered and they've shared information? Has anybody gotten in trouble for doing that?
I haven't seen any banks that have shared information that hasn't been registered, but I have seen registered banks that share information with each other, because when I go out and do audits and they're actually registered to share information, they typically are keeping track, obviously, of who they're sharing information with and who has requested information from them, and typically kind of what information they're sharing. And I have banks anywhere from the smallest one that I audited, I think they were about 92 million that shared information, and they were sharing information with Wells Fargo. Because they had, you know, customer that was both a customer from their bank and Wells Fargo. So they, you know, were able to get some additional information to assist them in saying, okay, what's really going on with this, and documenting that suspicious activity.
Yeah, you know, I know kiting is still going on. Some of it's, you know, check kiting, and some of it's ACH kiting, some of it's mobile deposit kiting, but it would seem to me that, you know, back in my day, and I've been in the banking world as long as you have as well, we used to just call the bank down the street and say, hey, you know, XYZ customer seems to be kiting between our two banks. What's going to happen here? What do you want to do? And I know with all the attorneys and everything, it's made it a lot harder for people to feel comfortable doing that. So a question came in on the chat. Can you elaborate on the deposit account field in the new SAR?
Well, under the, I'm trying to think of it. I believe it's the product type that's used. And I apologize because I don't remember exactly whether it says deposit account or checking account, but it should be checked. What happened was the original SAR had a box to check that. So you're checking, you know, whether it was a loan account or, you know, like for money service businesses, what types of accounts were involved with the activity. And then when they brought in the new SAR a few years ago, they left that off of there because they were copying things from an MSB SAR. And so they left that field off of that SAR. The new SAR that was introduced last year has that back on there, so that you can check that was the type of account that the activity was involved in. And I know that there's, when I do audit, when I conducted audits, especially right after that last SAR had been changed where that wasn't there, banks were forgetting to put that information in there.
Here.
And I know that it's not that you have to go back and make any changes if you haven't done that, but it was something that you should have been marking the other and putting in there that it was a deposit account that was involved in that suspicious activity, or checking account, savings account, whatever you wanted to describe it as. Excuse me. But if you haven't done that on those other SARs, don't go back and do anything with it. But the new SAR does have that box where you need to check that was the account type that was involved in the suspicious activity.
Okay. I have a question too in regards to some of these different automated systems that you've seen. And can you create some kind of a list maybe for me to send out to my members? I don't know that everybody knows that there are systems out there that'll do, and do they do an analysis and then create it? Or do you have to look at stuff and then tell it to create it? How does some of that work?
Well, the companies that, and for like Fiserv, they have an actual Fiserv product, FCRM, Financial Crimes Risk Management System, and actually it also has fraud. Most of these have a fraud system and a BSA system, so it looks for fraud in an account as well as BSA activity. But they will typically come in once you decide, okay, this is the product I want to get, and they will look at it, your system, and then create the system they need, the interfaces that they need. Of course, the testing needs to happen, and you need to make sure that all the information is flowing over properly. And then once it's set up, you set up your rules that you want, of the type of activity that you want to look at, and from there, it just works. Every day or week or month, these alerts come up that say, hey, this customer's activity was outside the parameters you set for normal activity, or for normal activity for that customer. And you work those alerts and say, okay, let's take a look at this activity and see what happened here, and make a decision on whether or not that's suspicious and whether you want to file a suspicious activity report for it.
So it's really an enterprise-wide risk management tool.
Yeah, really, it is.
Yep.
It is. I mean, the focus is on BSA, but most of these, like Verifin, also has fraud protections built in. So typically, in some larger institutions, I see operations reviewing the fraud alerts. It's usually for check fraud, those types of things, and then BSA analyzing the alerts for BSA-related issues, money laundering and that sort of thing.
Wow, very cool. Does anybody else have any other questions, or have any questions?
Yeah, maybe ask that or not.
Well, I mean, I can look into it too, but
Got a couple of phones that have got a little static on them.
You did this wrong?
Levon? I think there's a Levon. I think you're the one that we keep hearing in the background. So.
Oh, you are hearing me? It is
Yes, I
Levon.
am.
Sorry. My
That's
phone
okay.
says mute.
Oh,
Well,
no.
we kind of have
okay.
a question.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
So when you were talking about completing a SAR when someone is a victim, like of elder abuse, that we should just be putting their name in the narrative?
And
Were we
not as a
understanding you correctly on that?
Yes, you would not list that victim as a subject in the SAR, because they're not the ones that are conducting the suspicious activity. If you know who is conducting that, say it's their son or daughter or neighbor or something, that would be the information that you would put as the subject of the SAR, the person that is conducting the criminal activity.
So for instance, if someone has taken over her computer and set up A to A transfers or bill pay, we have no idea who this is. So
Right.
are we just in the subject area, leaving that all blank?
You would put unknown.
Okay.
And there are different requirements, dollar amount requirements, when you don't know who the subject is, who the person that was conducting this activity. And so those are higher dollar amounts than if you know who the subject is. So just make sure that you're looking at that too.
Okay.
Well, that's
Well, that's
interesting.
helpful.
Okay. Is there anything else? Well, I think, Diane, if you want to go ahead and hit the stop recording, you can stop recording, and I will post